Hello and welcome to the first Nietzsche module for his text Beyond Good and Evil. I think that's a really good title to kind of summarise his perspective and his viewpoint, because as we've briefly covered in class, he is pretty much amoral, so his thinking is beyond morality. He thinks morality itself is just this construct we come up with, that is the perspectives of dominant people and part like entangled with their prejudices and stuff like that, and he'll talk quite a bit about that in his text. So his idea is about going beyond just the things we label good and evil, and actually, I guess, thinking about the actual nature of things.
Yeah, I find it hard to pin down how he wants us to behave or what he wants us to be, because I think ultimately he doesn't have an answer to that, because somewhere in the text he talks about we're not worried about actions, we are worried about the nature of the human being in a way.
Yeah.
Because most moral philosophies give us some guidelines for how to behave, like utilitarianism.
And virtue ethics that we just looked at.
Exactly. They give us some guidelines for our actions, but Nietzsche doesn't really care how we act as long as we are strong individuals.
I guess let's end that three spirits idea, which is...
Three spirits?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's see. And I think, that's in chapter 203, which we're going to look at in this module as well.
Yep. So today in class we've already looked at 199, and so we'll very briefly recap that and then look at 201 and 203.
Okay, so section 199, which we looked at in class, he introduces these ideas of herds and commanders. Herds basically are groups of people who are obeying some kind of higher power. Mm-hmm. So like families obeying parents, and nations obeying their leaders.
So followers,
like
as opposed to leaders.
Yeah. And commanders are the people who are giving the orders to those groups.
Yep.
He talks about the danger of how if you are breeding into people this herd kind of mentality, you end up with everyone just kind of falling into that category.
Well, he's basically saying almost everyone in Europe at his time has become a herdman, right?
Yeah.
Even the leaders are essentially herdmen because they make up some higher authority that they're obeying, like God or the people or something like that.
Yeah, and he accuses them of moral hypocrisy. So they're all key ideas from that chapter you need to have an understanding of.
Nice.
So now we're going to move on to section 201.
So the structure of these Nietzsche modules is going to be that there's a brief summary of each section at the beginning. Each chapter, sorry. And then we're going to break down the points of each chapter in a little bit more detail. So section 203, the main point that you'll encounter here
201.
is... Oh, sorry, 201, thanks. The main point that you'll encounter here is the idea that the slave morality or the herd morality, that you can use those two terms kind of interchangeably. Basically, he thinks if you're a herd man, you're a slave because you're obeying some higher authority, right?
Yeah.
So those slave morals have not always been the case. They've kind of developed over time due to certain circumstances in society. And so that kind of brings us to the idea of moral relativism, which basically states that there's no absolute objective morals. Every moral thing that you believe is a product of your circumstances. So if you grew up in an Australian community, you're probably going to grow up with certain values about equality and a fair go. But if you grew up in the Middle East or in Africa or in Asia, you're going to have different perspectives. So the idea here, and I think the reason he makes these points, is to prove the point that the slave morals, which are so popular in his society, Europe, they're not absolute. They're just something that have evolved over time. So we shouldn't trust them as being the be-all and end-all of morality.
Yeah. So very quickly, this is a bit of a recap for when you're newer kids. This is probably a key quote that summarises that idea of morals developing over time. So he talks about how morals have developed from when in Europe the nations and the countries were under threat from external dangers, so other countries and tribes trying to attack and take over or whatever, and about how at that time they had morals that they valued, like adventurousness and vengefulness and recklessness, and they were kind of valued at that time.
So when those they're like more the severe morals, right?
Yeah.
Yep. So when they were useful to the community, they were valued.
Yeah.
But now...
So that was morally good at that stage.
Yep.
And then what it's saying here is that, well, when those dangers they're done with, which in his time of late 18th century...
19th century.
Yeah, 19th century, so 1800s in Europe, those dangers had subsided. So it was then they could look inwards and they started to fear the actual neighbours, so as in the people in their society. So those things like adventurousness and recklessness and vengefulness, they became things that weren't desired.
In fact, they became like vices.
Yes. In the Aristotle virtue scheme of things, yes, they became like excess of good, what is morally good. So that's, I guess, his way of showing that kind of shift and how morals have developed across the world.
Yeah, and we only believe in certain things based on our current circumstances and what's convenient for us, rather than actually it being true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So here he's kind of rejecting, I guess, misconception that he thinks exists that love for each other is what is motivating us in terms of forming morals. And he's saying, no, what actually is motivating us is our own feelings of safety. So what's actually motivating the development of morals in society is fear of neighbours and fear of the threat that they could pose to us. So we might try and say, oh no, I'm creating this moral to protect you, and because I love you and I want to care for you, but instead it's actually, no, it's a way of controlling them and keeping you safe.
Yeah, can I make a slightly broader point here? We discussed in my class how Nietzsche's philosophy seems very harsh and very cruel almost, very aggressive. But actually, like a deeper understanding of Nietzsche will show that he actually values love and all this kind of, really stuff that we would consider great stuff.
Yeah.
So like the point that he's making is we seem to value those things in our community, like loving one's neighbour and being nice to each other, but we're not valuing them for the right reasons, right? We're only valuing them out of fear because loving one's neighbour keeps us safe, So his overall point is you can't get to that stage of actually loving your neighbour unless you throw away the slave mentality, become like this fearless individual and rise up. That's the only point at which you can actually embrace love and all these other good things.
Yeah. So he's saying at the moment,
you
fear your neighbour, which is motivating you. And he wants you to get to the point, which is the point you're saying is kind of the point.
Yeah, so he's criticising the current situation because it's not
achieving love.
We're not actually achieving love. Yeah, we're achieving a stupid version of it. So as a result of our community really valuing its own safety and therefore being subject to this slave morality, Nietzsche says that the lamb and the sheep are held in higher and higher respect. So instead of looking at like a powerful animal like an eagle, I think an eagle comes up in one of his other writings, instead of looking at that as like the ultimate good symbol, we look at like a meek lamb or a sheep, which is a follower, as our like role models. And he's saying, this is a pretty lame situation, that we value those things. So Nietzsche makes this related point that in this society where we've come to fear each other and therefore we value lambs and sheep, we soften so much that we come to a stage where we don't even want to punish people who are doing the wrong thing. Like we become so weak that we think it's okay just to render someone harmless, to make them not violent anymore, rather than actually punishing them for their sins.
All right, so we're now up to chapter 203, and this quote here is kind of just setting it up. So in light of all this, And he's actually referring to, really in light of our rejection of democracy, which we're going to look at in a second, what should we do and what should we have faith in? So he's really here going, this is one of the core ideas of his whole text and his philosophy, is that what we are wanting to become are free spirits who rise above and kind of ignore and reject the herb sense of morality, the slave sense of morality, whatever you want to call it, and have our own sort of value and way of living. And so, this text is chapter of the text is going to say, okay, so we're going to reject democracy and we're going to become, like he says, new philosophers or even commanders, but like that really good sense of commander, like Napoleon, like who's completely independent of the values of the herd. So up until this point, he's described the slave morality, and now he's telling us what to do and what to embrace. Yeah. Okay, so at the very start of this chapter, Nietzsche kind of completely rejects the democratic movement, which is emerging in Europe at the time he's writing, and saying that it's a way of standardising us. So in class we talked about his views on how it like homogenises, and so it makes everyone, because a key idea of democracy is that everyone's equal, it's all about rights, we all have this right and this right and this right.
Well, it's the right to choose your own government, right, and be represented in the government. It's essentially the herd being part of the government.
Yes, but he also goes on about how it's tied up with it is the rights movement, and by giving us all these equal rights and saying that you have the right to this, you have the right to that, like it puts everyone on an even playing field. Yep. So it standardizes them, and also, as he says in this text, it mediocratizes them. Yeah, as in, it makes us mediocre. Yes, so like it brings us all down to the mean, right? Yeah. So he says it reduces their value. So, and he says, the democratic movement is a form assumed by man in decay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I like that. So that's the key ideas there. So it's reduced us down, and now he's like, okay, how are we going to actually rise above that? How are we going to become free spirits who evade this kind of process? So Nietzsche is heavily critical of how human history has evolved up to this point, right? I think the very first section, 199, he says that history has been like a series of retrogressions, which means just going backwards. And basically he thinks that history has unfolded just by chance, like humans just following the leader and not actually making anything intentional out of their lives. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So in light of that, he actually wants us to become new philosophers. He thinks that all philosophy, or most of philosophy that has gone previously, most notably utilitarianism, he really dislikes, and he'll criticise that in the next section. Yeah. He thinks all that has been a mistake and that we should become new philosophers, right? Mm-hmm. So what are the interests and aims of these new philosophers? Well, Nietzsche says that they need to teach man the future of man as his will. In other words, so this idea of will, what is will? Like doing what you want, knowing what you want and then acting on it, right? And so Nietzsche wants us to view human evolution as something that we can control. And as a result of that, he says we should prepare for great enterprises and collective experiments in discipline and breeding to make our future great. Now, you can see why this philosophy was used to promote Nazism, because when he talks about experiments in breeding, that sounds a bit dodgy. But he wants us to undertake these great things to make humanity glorious. Yeah. So in the key terms section, can you guys please note where he's saying will, these ideas that Ms. Fitz has just talked about, and also the ideas of like dominance, and it's about this, a key idea is like self-overcoming, so us overcoming this past and this history and forging our own. Okay, yeah. Cool, thanks.
So to further elaborate on the idea of these new philosophers and free spirits who Nietzsche wants us to become, I guess, he kind of makes this contrast between what makes herd men anxious versus what makes these free spirits and new philosophers anxious. What makes herd men anxious is, I guess, danger, like the idea that your safety could be threatened. But what makes these new philosophers anxious is knowing how great man could be, but then seeing man waste that potential, right? What does he say? There are few more grievous pains than once to have sensed how an extraordinary man missed his way and degenerated. So they really hate to see man waste his potential. And this really reminds me of Callicles, who I think when he's introducing his hedonistic philosophy, he says, like, there's nothing more shameful than a great man to not go after a life where he's expanding his desires. It really reminds me of that.
Okay.
So in the two chapters that we've covered today, well, I guess 199, 201, 203, I guess if you boiled it down, Nietzsche's main points have been that there's these slave morals which dominate contemporary European society, but they're not absolute. They are subjective because they've evolved over time in response to various historical circumstances. So in light of all this, Nietzsche's approach is to reject those slave morals and aim for something different, aim for this philosophy of the free spirits who go after...
so new philosophers.
New philosophers and free spirits who want higher aims for humanity and want to inspire greatness in humanity.
And for them.
Yeah, and for themselves, I guess, essentially.
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you. That's the end of Module 1. We'll see you in Module 2.